Climbing is a sport that's been around longer than the human race, a sport that's older than sports themselves, amongst other ancient sports like running, jumping, swimming, and throwing. All animals climb: monkeys, spiders, bears, snakes, fish, and cows. Eventually, the human race took this survival tool and turned it into a game, with legendary ascents like Burden of Dreams, Witness the Fitness, and V1776 Slab. And none of these came without many failed attempts. But when did humans start pushing the limits of climbing, and how long did it take for them to realize that something impossible to climb was possible? Well, today we're going to find out in this episode of History of Climbing Stuff: Bouldering Grades.
This is the history of climbing stuff. Bouldering edition.
Modern bouldering can be primarily traced back to 1870s France, in the commune of Fontainebleau. You see, there are three things that all French people love: baguettes, mimes, and rock climbing. They can't help it, alright? It's built into their genetic code. But the problem is, they weren't very good. By the year 1900, the hardest boulder ever sent was a V1. I guess a diet of bread and wine isn't very high in protein. But all of that changed when two legendary Frenchmen, Pierre Alain and René Ferlet, arrived on the scene. And in 1934, Alain would send shockwaves across the globe by sending the world's first V2, the arête of l'Aigle Alain. Now, before we move on, I know a lot of people will hear this and say, what's so impressive about sending a V2, right? Most people send V2 and after a few sessions in the gym. Gotta remember, they didn't have climbing gyms back then. Also, they didn't have climbing shoes, okay? You try sending a V2 in fucking clogs. The whole world was talking about Pierre and his iconic top of a seemingly impossible V2 boulder. In an instant, he had become a star. Money, women, and fame, all at his fingertips. Gatorade sponsorships, crypto investments, and AG1, Pierre had it all. He even secured a deal with a local shoemaker and created the first line of rock climbing shoes. That actually happened. That one is actually true. I did not make that one up. But while Alain was burning bright, he cast a long shadow, and in it was his friend, René Ferlet. What was once a passion for bouldering, forged in the fires of friendship, had now been tainted by fame, and it was time for René to set the record straight. The location? Fontainebleau, France. The target? Pierre Alain's boulder proj, a V3 unnamed slab. And the mission? Send Pierre's boulder project before he does. So René set off on a quest to be the first man to ever send a V3. He spent the next 12 years training vigorously. This is fucking ridiculous. And in 1946, he ascended Pierre's V3 slab project and named it after his lady love, Mary Rose. It took me like 6 months to climb V3. I don't know what he was doing for 12 years. I get it was harder back then, but 12 years to be the first person to ever climb V3. I mean, to be fair, Adam Ondra did fall on Mary Rose. That's a kind of an iconic fumble by Adam Ondra, so it is hard. While René would be the first man to ever climb a V3, his record wouldn't stand as long as Pierre's, because only 7 years later, in 1953, a man would emerge from the shadows and send the world's first V6 Le Joker. I don't know what happened to V4 and V5. I guess we're just skipping over those. Nobody knows who did those, okay? The man was Robert Perregaux, and the Joker was René Ferlet, for dedicating his life to a boulder half the grade of Robert's send. René's name would fade into obscurity. Mary Rose would leave him for Robert, as he was a stronger boulderer, and he wore a cool beanie. And it seemed that France would be the bouldering frontier forever, as French climbers continued to push the boundaries far beyond what many thought was possible. That was until a new challenger came along. A civilization long forgotten by the French, forged by the fires of war, known not only for their concerningly high childhood obesity rates, but their love of coffee too. The Americans. Teton Range, USA. A young man, 21 years of age, does the unthinkable. He skips V7 altogether and sends the world's first V8 Gill Wright problem. And his name was John Gill. A red-blooded American had stepped onto the scene and taken the world by storm. And he loved nothing more than some fake titties, a warm bush light. A red-blooded American had stepped onto the scene and taken the world by storm. And he loved nothing more than some fake titties, a warm bush light, and crushing boulders. The French were blindsided. They rushed to put up a V8 boulder of their own. In Fontainebleau, a French climber named Jérôme Jean Charles sent Le Carnage V8, the world's first V8 Plus. Leave it to the French to add a plus to something and act like they were the first ones to do it. Like, we already did V8, okay? We already got it. You gotta do something else. You can't just add a plus to it.
Yes, but ours was slightly harder, therefore it is the first ascent, no?
There's no such thing as V8 and V8 Plus, okay? I don't care if you use the French system or not. It's just V8. But the French would find their efforts were in vain, because only a year after his iconic V8, in 1959, John Gill would send the world's first V9. And it seemed the French had a problem, and it was a Gill problem, because that's literally what the name of the boulder was. The first V9 ever sent was called Gill Problem, by John Gill. The man was a mathematician, okay? Sorry he wasn't a fucking creative arts major. You see, aside from being a mathematician, Gill was also a U.S. Air Force veteran, as well as a gymnast. He went on to introduce chalk into rock climbing, as well as incorporating dynamic gymnastics movements, which we now call dynos. Shout out. John would dominate the bouldering scene for 2 decades until the culmination of his career in 1978, when he sent the world's first V10, the Groove. As John retired to a quiet life on the countryside, I assume, I actually have no idea what he did, the French and Americans would spend the next decade fighting for the top spot in bouldering. In France, Jackie Godofé would put up the world's first V11 Tête de Main, only for the Americans to clap back with the world's first V12 Trice, sent by Jim Holloway. And it seemed that the French-American War would rage on forever, until the most unlikely opponent of all stepped in. Switzerland, known for their neutrality in war, threw their hat into the ring. The date, 1992. The climber, Fred Nicole, a man with 2 first names. On a warm spring morning, I assume, Fred sends the world's first V13, oh fuck me, La Danse des Balrogs. The Dance of the Balrogs, is that what that translates to? Shout out Lord of the Rings. Fred Nicole seems like a cool dude. The French and the Americans watched in awe as a young man from the mountains of Switzerland brought their war to an end. And only 4 years later, in 1996, Fred would send Raja, the world's first V14. Not much is known about Fred Nicole on Wikipedia, but I like to think he was a quiet man, a kind man, with 2 first names and a heart of gold. Oh shit, he's still alive. He's still alive. He's only 54? Okay, well, sorry, Fred, if for some reason you're watching this, which would be cool. Thank you. In the year 2000, Fred went on to send the world's first V15, Dreamtime. But the world wasn't ready. You see, the French and Americans teamed up in a last-ditch effort to put Fred down, and downgraded Dreamtime to V14. But what they didn't realize is nothing can keep Fred down. Because in 2002, Fred would send Monkey Wedding, the world's new first V15. And in the same year, Fred would also put up Black Eagle SDS, the world's second official V15. Fred would send both of these boulders in South Africa, far enough away so that the Americans were too fat and the French were too snobby to ever go there, ensuring his V15s would never be downgraded again. Since the year 2002, new grades have slowed down significantly. In the past 20 years, only 2 new grades have been reached. In 2008, Christian Core would send Gioia, which would be established as the world's first V16. And only a year later, in 2009, a young Finnish climber named Nalle Hukkataival would send Live in Large, which he graded at V15. But after a few years, many prominent climbers attempted Live in Large, and they all agreed it was actually V16. So Nalle put up the second V16 in human existence and thought it was too easy, which sounds weird because this guy comes out of nowhere and just puts up a V16 and doesn't even realize it's a V16. But it starts to make sense when you hear the next part of the story, which is he had a small boulder project in his backyard. that he finally sent, and he was so proud of it, and he decided to name it Burden of Dreams. For those of you that don't understand the significance of that, Burden of Dreams would be the first V17. For a little backstory on Burden of Dreams, since it's obviously a very iconic boulder now, the world's first V17, Nali Hukataival, not very well known at this point in the climbing world, uploads this video in 2016 of him sending this boulder, which has become the world's first V17, only being repeated by one other climber, Will Bosey. Since Nali's seemingly accidental creation of V17, there have been 3 new V17 boulders put up and 4 new climbers to send them. And that is the entire history of bouldering grades, with a few creative liberties thrown in there, just a couple of them. And I'll just end this video by saying it's been nearly a decade since the first V17 was sent, so I think it's about time for the first V18. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you learned something. This has been History of Climbing Stuff, Bouldering Grades.